Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the beginning of the Scottish Government's attempt to get some legal certainty on the issue of holding a public poll on the issue of Scottish independence, and effectively whether or not the people of the UK have the right to self-determination, really. I'll also be discussing Alex Salmond's little intervention as well. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So the Scottish Government has opened its case in the Supreme Court, started yesterday. Worth beginning by explaining what is and isn't being sought. Inevitably, there's a lot of talk linking the referendum that the SNP and the Scottish Greens wish to hold next year and the one that was held 9 years previously in 2014. These are not the same thing. The referendum of 2014 came as a result of a clear indication that Scotland should have an independence referendum based on voting habits, and Westminster fully complied with the process. It was a referendum that was in effect binding. If Leave had won, the UK would have begun the process of dissolving at its most defining border. The Scottish Government are not seeking permission to hold another referendum like this. It's worth stating that from the outset because I think a lot of people are thinking they are. In reality, despite the arguments for and against another independence referendum, nobody is seriously arguing that such a poll could go ahead if Westminster is stubbornly opposed to it. Of course, that attracts the inevitable comparisons with Brexit. How could Brexit supporters have behaved if it turned out the UK wasn't allowed to leave the EU without the permission of the EU Parliament, say? How is it any different for Scotland to be told it must remain in a union that it voluntarily joined because other members of it don't want it to go? But anyway, what are the Scottish Government asking for? They're just asking for a clarification that they can be allowed to hold a referendum on whether eligible voters would want Scotland to become an independent nation outside of the UK, but for information only. We just want to find out for certain. You know, you can see why the Conservatives want to oppose it in a sense, because those were the conditions under which the Brexit referendum was conducted. And afterwards, they insisted it was the will of the people and had to be completed no matter what. But it wasn't binding. Oh, yes, it was. Tricky. The Scottish Government's argument is that there is a clear mandate for it because people in Scotland have consistently voted for representatives in both Holyrood and Westminster that explicitly stand on such a policy. Now, a little bit cheeky on the Westminster front, because the SNP specifically stood on a platform in 2019 of a vote for the SNP was not a vote for independence, but just a vote against the Conservatives and their Brexit, as well as the more usual domestic policies. However, no such fun and games for Holyrood elections, and the last one was fought very, very clearly, very, very specifically on this platform. In addition, like I say, the Scottish Government's argument is that they want to conduct an indicative poll only. No legal compulsion being laid on anyone to follow through with it afterwards. Now, I noticed the former SNP leader, Alex Salmond, is having a pop. He says there's nothing significant to be won from this case. Basically, he's attacking the case. He says there's no reason to have it. You're not really going to win anything significant if you win anything at all. I don't think, to my satisfaction, he really explained why that is. But I did notice that he seemed more keen on the idea of using the next Westminster elections as a specific referendum with what he called a united front from the three parties, the SNP, his former party, the Scottish Greens, who are also in favour, and his new Alba party. Now, this is, of course, the SNP's Plan C anyway, or at least to use the next Westminster elections as a proxy referendum if the Supreme Court case doesn't go their way. But it seems clear to me that having legal certainty on various aspects of the issue is always a good thing. It's always nice to know where you stand on legal ground, surely. We're talking about something unprecedented here. How can you argue that finding out exactly where the law stands is not a useful thing to do? Call me an old cynic, but what Salmond is after here is a bit of a deal, isn't it? He doesn't want the Supreme Court to rule in favour of the Scottish Government. Why? Because then the SNP Plan C will roll into action if it finds against. This is that the SNP stand only on a platform of Scottish independence at the next Westminster elections. No other policies, just that. That's what Sturgeon said. That way they get to claim that every vote for the SNP is a vote for an independence referendum. If it returns them a clear majority of the seats, as seems likely at this point, then they claim an even more powerful mandate than the one they have. So how does that benefit Salmond? Well, he only formed his party because he seems to miss being relevant and maybe resents the far better job Sturgeon is doing of running the party than he did. He clearly doesn't want to become the Scottish nationalism equivalent of UKIP, fading into obscurity and only able to attract the loons that struggle in the mainstream party. It'd be much more that he'd want to model his party along the success that the Brexit party had, in terms of forcing the Conservatives in 2019 to adopt certain policies and to stand by certain policies. That's what he wants to do with the SNP, be an influencer of the SNP from the outside by threatening their votes. And he does hold the odd card here. Westminster elections are, of course, run on a strictly first-past-the-post basis. If he stands his candidates, and with Labour gaining a share of popular support in Scotland recently as well, there's every chance that the SNP could lose quite a few seats as a result of the votes being split. Those in favour of Scottish independence would almost certainly pin vast majority of their votes to the SNP. It's the established party for that. Why wouldn't you? You know, it's the most credible way of achieving your aims. But there's always going to be some voting for others. There's always going to be some, say, voting for Alba. And in a tight contest, it only needs a few hundred to make a difference. What Salmond is after here is a deal, isn't it? For the three pro-independence parties to stand a single candidate between them in each constituency. But again, why would he want that? Weaken the power of the SNP. The question for the SNP, I suppose, would be, is it worth it? Because it sounds like it would, but what if they stood a candidate down to let the Alba candidate have a clear run? Then it turns out that their campaigning is shite and Labour just romp it. Tricky, isn't it? But that's for later and only relevant in the instance that the Supreme Court say that even a non-binding referendum isn't within the power of the Scottish Government. The tidiest outcome is that the court says that as the proposed referendum doesn't change the constitutional settlement of Scotland within the UK, that there's no reason not to run it. The referendum would then be carried out next autumn as planned. Then the Conservatives have got a choice, haven't they? The first is to ignore the referendum as a political stunt. The problem then is the pro-independence campaign is more likely to win. Of course, Labour and the Lib Dems would campaign for Remain, but those Tories tend to be pretty slick with their well-funded campaign machine, don't they? This is exceptionally risky because if the result turns out to support independence, it may not be binding, but the party who claims that an unbinding referendum represents the settled will of the people for years afterwards cannot really resist pressure for a binding referendum for very much longer, can it? It may be a few years, but the SNP can be patient here because they only need to win once. The second choice is that the Conservatives do campaign against independence, meaning that they are more likely to win. Truth be told, I've already said that I think they should have agreed to a binding referendum anyway. When it looks like the Tories are on the way out at the next election, there's an even bigger chance of winning, surely. Resisting it against a very obvious public mandate only strengthens support for leaving. But if Leave did win, so let's say they campaigned for it, which they should. They add credibility to it. So if Leave did win anyway, then the Conservatives really don't have a leg to stand on. They'll have campaigned, so they can't dismiss it as a stunt because they engaged. Doesn't matter that it's not binding because neither was the Brexit referendum. Absolutely nowhere to hide then. I suppose the third option would be the Conservatives could campaign in it on the Leave side, maybe to try and drain a few votes away from Remain. Oh, I'm not voting for the Tories. Actually, that would be a cunning trick. Yeah, let's do that. Do that. I don't think they can, though. But it'll be tricky for the Tories, though I still say the best bet is just to embrace it. Strategically as well as morally, embrace it. What if the court says that no referendum can take place, binding or not? Then the Scottish Government claim, with good reason, that there's no legal route to self-determination for the Scottish people if a largely English-dominated Parliament objects. Sturgeon knows there will be another independence referendum at some point before too long. There has to be. The case for it's overwhelming. As long as the SNP remain dominant in Scottish politics, it's overwhelming. Everyone can see it. Being able to claim that Scotland has no free will in this way is a powerful argument. And it's absolute madness that the Tories will allow that to happen. You know, it's just another reason why the Tories should have agreed to at least the non-binding referendum, but I would have said the binding one. Because the most damaging thing that can happen to any genuine one nation Tories right now, and I say that because strategically there's a lot of benefit to the Conservatives in Scotland leaving the UK. The Conservatives don't win many seats in Scotland. Even before they went completely loopy, they didn't win that many seats in Scotland. It was a minority of them. So when the way to win power is to win a majority of the seats in Parliament, having a part of the UK that never returns you a majority of seats is a barrier to your plans to govern. Having Scotland leave makes it much easier for the Conservatives to win elections in what's left. But there are genuine one nation Tories who want the UK to remain together. Okay, the worst thing that can happen to them is that they win this case. Because if it's determined that a largely English-dominated Parliament can tell Scotland what it can and can't do, even a decent, competent government coming to power in a couple of years may not be able to save the UK. But there we are. We will follow this with interest. I will anyway. But those are my thoughts for now. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.